Hey, I'm science illustrator and artist Mattias Lanas. Today, I'll be painting a complex subject, a botanical thicket incorporating lots of different watercolor techniques and having fun along the way. This demonstration is inspired by the intricate artwork Cerulean Valley Hedge by artist-explorer Tony Foster from Cornwall County in the United Kingdom. Foster's created many paintings in Cornwall over the years because this is where he calls home. For decades, he and his wife Anne have been based at the self-described one-pub town of Tywardreath. The couple is well acquainted with the county's varied and beautiful landscapes. In Tony's words, Cornwall's rugged cliffs and clear seas, bleak uplands, deep flower-filled valleys, rolling green hills, and hidden corners where nature has run wild provide places of breathtaking beauty that can be found by walking for an hour or two from my own back door. For the Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey, Foster decided to nominate Cornwall and include 6 different artworks, both large and small format. Cerulean Valley Hedge is one of the smallest of these pieces, and one of my favorites for the way that it invites us to look closely at this botanical microcosm and exquisitely highlights the local flora. The thicket is attractively rendered in watercolor. It features a sea of green shapes punctuated by flashes of white, blue, pink, and yellow flowers. The variety and placement of the greens gives us a sense of depth, of 3D-ness, hinting at a thickness to the vegetation beyond the sheet of paper upon which it's painted. The painting is at the same time overwhelming and deceptively simple. It feels organic and playful. Painting a botanical thicket like this can be daunting, especially for someone new to watercolors. I sometimes even find it difficult to know where to start. A helpful approach for complex subjects generally is to make decisions about what elements are worth including and which are best excluded from the final painting. As the artist, you have control over what you choose to paint, and you can direct your piece as you see fit. So, sometimes you'll want to simplify a subject like this in order to allow the important aspects to come forward. For today's thicket, I've chosen this photo of a nasturtium plant, complete with leaves and bright flowers. What I love about this subject is that the shapes of the leaves are a little simpler than the relatively chaotic hedge in Tony's painting, more approachable to start with. There's still plenty of challenge here in trying to convey depth, multiple levels of leaves and flowers on top of each other, filling the space, challenge in working on highlights and shadows, and challenge in mixing up colors and so on. You can choose to paint as much or as little as you like. One of the most important preliminary aspects for this demonstration will be laying the foundation, that is, creating the pencil drawing. Without solid guidelines, it'll be significantly more difficult to do the watercoloring after. I'll be painting this piece section by section and at different times, so I need to clearly understand what's what. If you're painting along with me today, make sure to first watch my materials video. I have a whole bunch of watercoloring tools with me for this painting, including watercolor paper, a sharpened pencil and an eraser, water, watercolor paints and assorted brushes, and a sponge or paper towel. I also have an old toothbrush and an artist's knife for adding final touches at the end. Depending on how you like to work, early on you may also want to use some liquid masking fluid or Frisket to mask out some of the light areas of this subject. Remember to print out or have a digital download of the nasturtium photo handy. Get everything ready and spend plenty of time getting the subject drawn out in pencil. Let's get going. So here you can see my drawing. As I just mentioned, you'll want to spend some time on that drawing to make sure that you understand fully what it is that you're painting. And so I spent a couple of hours on this one in particular, and I decided to include these dark areas, these shadows, some of the more extreme shadows. I'll explain why in a second, but you don't have to do that. You can stick with a line drawing if you'd like and just paint in those dark areas later with darker colors. But I felt moved to add these pencil marks in here just to help me understand the subject a bit more and get a sense of its depth. And on that note, I'd like to introduce a concept known as divots of darkness that was introduced to me by one of my art school teachers, Ann Cottle. And the idea behind divots of darkness, when working with microcosm type subjects like this, it could be a botanical thicket, it could be any other kind of close-up microcosm, you want to capitalize on these dark spaces between subject areas. So in this case, between the flowers and the leaves, because making those dark enough is going to help convey depth in this patch. It's going to help give us a sense of there being multiple layers from top to bottom in this patch. And so I'm going to continue to refer to these divots of darkness as we go and make sure that these spaces are getting dark enough to give us the effect of depth. So I also mentioned that as the artist, I get to choose what elements of this piece I want to highlight. And that means choosing how much detail to include from the reference photo as well. I've hinted at some of the details in these dark areas, but also left some more ambiguous, and figure that when I get to the watercolor, I'll decide in the moment whether I want to clarify some of those details or just leave them as is to let the other details stand out more. I've also added a little bit more to some of the edges to expand this thicket a little bit, and then removed some areas that I felt were giving it a very square feel that I didn't want. I wanted something more organic around the edge. And I've decided I'm not going to use Frisket on this piece, but if you have some and you'd like to, you're more than welcome to, especially on the lighter areas such as the veins on the leaves, perhaps the insides of the flower if there's areas that are in light, etc. For the sake of time, I'm not going to talk through every step of the process that I'm going to use to create this piece. Rather, I'll just talk about major points and then do a lot more quiet demonstration, which I'll speed up so as not to make this video too long. But the idea here is that a lot of these techniques I'm using will have been covered in other videos. This is my first time painting this piece. I'm going to try it out and let's see how it goes. So let's begin by mixing some colors. For my greens, I'm going to create a base of hooker's green, probably with some cadmium yellow, which is a very warm yellow, as these leaves are very bright. Make sure to get plenty of that. We got a lot of leaves to cover, but I'm not too worried about it having too much of the same color because we got different kinds of greens in here. And let's test that out. It's a very bright green. It looks like I need to mute it down, but it's a good base to start with. So I'm going to take some of that, just start a new well over here, and have that be more diluted. So add some water. There's different ways to start a watercolor like this, and it kind of depends on your style. I think I'm going to go and do the leaves and flowers and then work towards the darks over time. And I will also cover some of the darks as I work and build up some layers of darkness that will increase in intensity over time. So it'll be helpful to have some of these more bold pencil lines in here so they don't get washed away as I work. So let's see this. That seems good. Let's start with that. So I'm gonna choose this prominent leaf down here and start to lay some of this in. I'm not sure yet whether I'm going to omit these veins or not. I think I will, but if it turns out to be too tedious, then I may just fill them in and then try to lift them out later. I'm going into the dark area because I'm trying to build up that color anyways. The only place I really don't want to put too much green like this is in the reds for the flowers, or any really light areas that I won't be able to lift up later. Some of these leaves have a bit of a bluish hue to them, and some have more of the yellow, and so I can take some cerulean, just a touch, and experiment with laying that in parts of the leaf, especially while it's wet. It'll give me some more darkness, closer to a shadow, but it'll also maybe give it some of that bluiness. Let's try some other. So this one over here. And I like this flat brush for these shapes because I can get a really clean edge with just the edge of the brush itself. And if I were doing maybe smaller, finer subjects, I might choose a different brush, something small and round, perhaps to let me get into all the nooks and crannies, but this flat one works pretty well. And I liked what that cerulean is doing, so I'm going to take some more of that, start a little pocket of it over here, make sure to dilute it well enough, and then add some of my green to it. So it's just a slightly bluier version of our green. And there's a couple leaves that look like could use that. So this one here, for example. Treating this one very playfully, enjoying the process. I'm going to do all the rest of the leaves now. I'm adding in some shadows and not being precise about the color, but more just increasing the intensity of the color to help me keep track of what is light and what is shadow. And later I'll just build up that color towards something that's closer to what I'm seeing. But for now, just a deeper green works. All right, that's maybe good for the leaves that are in light the most, the ones that I want to paint. Now there's a bunch of leaves that are in darkness, and I can mix up something darker for that. So I think I'm going to take some French Ultramarine and just add it to this mixture. And that bright, warm yellow with this blue, more of a cool blue, looks like it's making a good dark, kind of muddy green. Something that is useful for these darker leaves. So now I'm gonna work on those. I darken this area here because it is very dark in the reference photo. Later I'll go in and just clarify a little of the detail in there, but in general I want this to sort of stay down in the background. I'm going to darken it further so that these flowers and these leaves around can come forward. Now I'm going to take a break just because I'm getting tired of so many greens. I'm going to go for some of the yellows now, or yellowy greens, focusing on stems and areas that are in light. I'll take some cadmium yellow over here and add some of my green to it. This is off screen, but it's just some cadmium yellow with a little green, perhaps a little more cadmium yellow, get it to be closer to a lime green rather than a bright green, something that's more yellow. It's about the same really. Let's try a little more. And I'm going to dull it down a little bit with just a touch of yellow ochre. Not too much, but enough to give it kind of an earthiness, something like that. And that's a good color, but I have to dilute that because it's way too bright. So first layer especially, we're going to add some water to it. So just going to enjoy putting some of this down in places where I see some yellow, and that'll act as a good foundation layer for later putting some greens and or muting down this yellow with other colors. I see some of this on stems. I see it a bit on some of the nasturtium leaves. On a lot of these very shaded stems as well. And if anything, it's just helpful for me to know, to see those colors in there, because then I can remember, oh yeah, there's a stem there, and I can deepen the value later. I can darken that, but we're just trying to give some form to these different lines, these different shapes. This is also a good yellow to put into some of the base layer for parts of the red nasturtium. It feels a little bit like paint by number. I'm choosing the different areas that have these colors in them and then laying them in as I see them. I see yellow here, 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 etc. So I'm placing those in. All right, seems to be covered pretty well. Maybe down here. Right. I think next I'm going to focus on some darks. I'm working on this patch by patch rather than bringing the entire thing to completion. And that's okay, there's different styles of working. If you prefer to do one layer at a time and build the whole piece together, that is great as well. But I'm most excited now to start adding in some of these divots of darkness and really emphasizing them. And that will bring me past this sort of messy stage into something that feels a bit more like it's on its way to being a completed painting. So for that, I'm going to take my darkest green that I have here and add French Ultramarine. I'm going to make this really dark. And I'm going to mute that a little bit by adding, let's try some burnt sienna. It's a more earthy color now. Deep earthy green. And in places where I'm very confident I want dark colors, I can start to put this in. So for example, in here. Using a small brush to get that fine detail now. I could add a little more blue to this, but worst case I can do another layer on top and darken it and also change the hue slightly. But these rich divots of darkness are allowing me to see some depth. I can see through these flowers all the way down to the ground. Something that I wanted to try for demonstration purposes and just to experiment a little bit is to take a used toothbrush, so I have this one here, and try spraying a bit of color on the piece to give it some grit and a feel of rawness. And this may or may not work, but let's give it a try. My thinking is that now is a good time, since I have most of my greens put down. I can spray a bit of green color and then do some cleanup before I apply the reds. What I don't want is to mute my composition afterwards, since it's a little hard to control the spray anyways. So the first thing I'm going to do is lay down some mask. I'm going to use my paper towels and just cover up some of the areas that I don't want to get covered with spray. So basically just forming a barrier around this. And I might open it up just a tad, depending on how much I want on there. Let's try that. Let's see, so I got my colors back. I'm going to use this darker green and just re-wet that. This isn't hard to do. I mean, it's pretty intuitive. I'm just going to put some watercolor on the toothbrush and then spray it. But I want to do it in a way where I can control as much as possible, get a little bit of that gritty effect without completely obscuring all this work that I've done already. So there, I've re-wet my color. You can probably do this with a brush as well, but it helps if the bristles are a little bit stiffer, so they can flick the paint and disperse it a bit more. So pick some up with my toothbrush and simply, let's see how this goes. And this toothbrush is doing a nice job of spraying very finely. If you wanted to do thicker applications, you could use a brush and just kind of whip your brush, making sure to cover a wider area because that tends to spray more widely. Okay, so I think maybe a little more right here, just to give this some texture and, as I was saying, a little grit. And some of this is going to be obscured as I continue to work on the painting. And then let's see, there's some areas where I didn't want as much of this. So for example, on the flowers, what I can do is take my paper towel, dip a little bit in water, and just dab or pick up some of this where it is on the flowers while it's still wet. And I can also take a brush and do the same. So here I've got a clean brush that I'm wetting, and I can also just kind of mop some of that up. But I'll do more of that cleanup later when I'm getting closer to the actual reds that are going to go in here. Now let's continue going in with more greens. So again, just continuing to build up color. And I'll just continue putting in darks. Right, I need a break from doing greens and from doing divots of darkness, so I think I'm going to start now with flowers. I'll put in a foundation and then see where I go from there. So first, let's mix up some reds. I'll switch my palette around so you can see these colors. So oranges can be tricky. These nasturtium flowers have a very bright reddish orange, so I'm going to lay a foundation of a warm, bright yellow, which is the cadmium yellow. I'll take that color and put some in here. And then to that, I'm going to try adding a bit of Alizarin Crimson. It's feeling like this is a little muted down. I want something that's a bit brighter, so let's try Permanent Rose instead. And I'll just mix in the rest of that Alizarin Crimson, that's okay. So Permanent Rose seems a little brighter. I'm going to do that. So take Permanent Rose and form over here bright, bright red. It's like an orangey red. Let's test that. Seems pretty good as a foundation. I'll take some of this and lay it in with more yellow and start with a lighter orange, something that's more of a yellowy orange, and then build up from there. I'm trying to see the lightest hues in these flowers and start with those first, so make sure to dilute this as well. So I've got this nice orange base, and then I've got a brighter red here at the top. I've diluted this a little bit and you can see. So let's go for it. I'll lay in this foundation. This flower seems to have less of a yellow or orangish base, and it seems slightly more salmon in color. Same with this one here. So I'm going to switch directly to this mixture that I made, diluted version of this, to form the foundation. Something like that. Here I'm just adding some of this reddy color, the salmon color, very diluted form of it, to some of the stems and bits of plant material that are in the background. We're going to cover most of that up with dark area for the divots of darkness, but it's still nice to have some of that come through. And in general, I find that greens really look more natural when they have a bit of a muted color to them. So in this case, this red or a brown. So especially some of these leaves in the background, you can add just little bits of brown, and that helps break up the power of the green a little bit, make it look like something a bit more natural, but very diluted. I want this to be pretty subtle. All right, so I've got my foundations pretty much built now, and I'm going to continue just adding more detail to this. Let's take a different red now and add a second layer to these. Permanent rose, bright magenta, that is the permanent rose. I'm using a smaller brush for this as well now that I'm getting more detailed with these flowers. And let's add some cadmium yellow to that. Maybe a little water to that. And I'm just going to add another layer to these flowers to intensify their color a bit more. Now that they've got their under layer painted in, I can start to add in something like this. Take a break from reds and we'll go to greens once more. I'm going to add some raw umber to a green just to mute it down some more and create a color that I can use for more of my shadows and in these divots of darkness as well. So I'll try some of this, an earthier green, and some burnt sienna as well. Mute that down even further. And then I think some French ultramarine. And a small brush. So now I'm going to try to fill in as many of the divots of darkness as I can. This is going to take a while. Now I'm going to move on to adding a couple more yellows to the leaves. I feel like particular ones could use some more of a bright cadmium yellow. So I've got this mixture here that I'd previously prepared, cadmium yellow and some hooker's green. Make sure that that's diluted well. Maybe a bit too bright still. A little more water. And that's better. And then I can lay this over some of the leaves that I feel like need that extra touch of yellow. And now back to some greens. And now let's go to the flowers. So these will be reds. Back to this red mixture that I had. Just gonna re-wet some of this orange here. Get some permanent rose onto my brush. And we'll just add some more details with the brighter reds, slowly bringing these flowers to life. I think I'm going to come back with a round brush, this kind of brush, and I feel pretty good about the reds now. Add in some shadows. So for that I'm going to use French Ultramarine primarily. Take some of that over here in this quadrant, mix it with a little bit of that cadmium yellow that I had in there. I like to reuse the colors I have on my palette. Test that out really quick. It's a muted blue. I might make it a tad more intense. Something like that. And I'll come over some of the shadows on the flowers and just add these in. And it's a little scary to add this blue in, but you gotta just go for it. This is kind of the final step. So I'm pretty much done at this point, but I'm going to take my blade and add a couple of highlights just to make use of this tool. And basically I'm just going to scratch out some of the paper very lightly because I don't want these effects to be too intense, but anywhere where I want to whiten slightly, I can do that. And if you use Frisket in doing your own, then you could also reveal your whites that way. But it's just a couple areas that I'm going to hit to add some extra highlights. And then take my pencil and maybe reinforce some of my darks in just a couple of places. And that should be it. So there you have it. I really enjoyed working on such a varied subject and hope that you did too. Take a step back and peer at your piece. What do you think? Sometimes it's worth looking at your art from a bit of a distance or even taking a break and coming back to see it with fresh eyes just to give you new perspectives. How do your darks and lights align with those in the reference photo? Are the darks dark enough? Maybe dark enough for your liking? Do the highlights stand out enough? Would it be worth lifting some more paint from certain areas? Does the painting look like a thick nasturtium thicket? At the end of the day, you're the artist and your piece is done when you say it is, so don't feel you need to overwork it. Now that you've completed this botanical thicket, feel free to try others. Anything with multiple plants growing together, or especially with grasses, will add a whole nother level of challenge, likely necessitating smaller, thinner brushes and more patience while working to paint in all of the different shapes created by overlapping leaves and the divots of darkness between them. Definitely work your way up to more challenging subjects though, and paint what excites you. Keep a camera handy while you're out and about in case you stumble upon an interesting patch of plants. Even weeds growing on a sidewalk or a neighbor's potted plants might provide interesting compositions for you. Working from photos is a great way to get going. Eventually, you can also consider working en plein air right out in front of live plants. If you enjoyed this episode, consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the Foster's YouTube channel. You can view all the other art lesson videos in this series here on YouTube and also on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for joining me.